By the time Red Timber Pass began running out of fresh meat, the only smoke in the valley that still smelled like food came from a shed behind Mara Bell's cabin. Not from the company store, not from Silas Vane's big provision barn with its painted sign and padlocked doors. From a squat, dark little building of rough boards and stone, where a woman everyone had laughed at in September kept feeding a slow fire that would not die. 2 months earlier, the first cold edge in the wind had only just arrived. Aspens on the slopes above town were turning to coins of yellow and gold. Mule deer still moved through the timber in easy, fat-backed lines. The mornings carried frost on the grass, but the sun still had enough strength by noon to make a man forget what was coming. Most people in Red Timber Pass considered that a mercy. Mara Bell considered it a warning. She had been raised by a hunter who never trusted the mountains to be kind twice in a row. Her father had shown her how to read cloud and wind, how to tell the difference between a light winter and a mean one by the way elk coats thickened, and how early the birds left the high meadows. The signs that year were not gentle. Snow had dusted the peaks in August, and refused to melt from the shaded cuts. The nights dropped hard and fast. Game moved down out of the highest basins sooner than anyone liked. Bad one coming, her father would have said. He was not there to say it. He had died 3 winters earlier, on a hunting trip gone wrong, leaving behind little more than his tools, the old shed frame behind the cabin, and a daughter who remembered every lesson he had ever spoken as if it were scripture. Prepare, even when others scoff. Store, even when others swear the wagons will come. If you can keep people from going hungry, you do it, whether they thank you or not. On a chill morning in early September, Mara stood behind the cabin and looked at the ruin that had once been her father's smoke shed. The roof had sagged under 3 years of snow. One wall leaned crooked. The stone fire pit inside was black with old ash and moss. A lesser person might have pulled it down and used the wood for kindling. Mara tightened her shawl against the wind and began to rebuild. She stripped the rotten boards, cut new ones from a small stand of lodgepole her father had once marked for future use, and lifted each into place herself. She hauled stone from the creek to shore up the corners, daubed gaps with clay and ash, and left one small high vent where smoke could escape slow and steady instead of racing out and wasting the heat. By the time the first of the leaves started falling, the smoke shed was upright again. Not pretty, not straight, but tight. Inside, she hung the iron hooks her father had used, rubbed them clean, and ran her hand along the rafters, measuring space the way he had taught her, not in boards, but in meals. Enough, she murmured to the empty shed. Then she went out to fill it. Mara was not the only one bringing meat into Red Timber Pass that autumn. Hunters came down with elk quarters in blood-dark canvas. Trappers traded beaver pelts for bacon at the company store. Men on freight wagons hauled in barrels of salt pork from the railhead 200 miles east. But one man touched nearly all of it before anyone else did. Silas Vane. He was not a hunter himself. He was something colder. The kind of supplier the frontiers seemed to grow whenever a camp lasted long enough to pretend it was a town. Vane owned the main storage barn, the biggest salt room, and the only rail contract for tinned meat. The mining company paid him to keep the camp provisioned, and he charged whatever he pleased. If a family in town wanted decent cuts for winter, they passed through his hands and paid his price, or went without. As long as the wagons rolled on schedule and the passes stayed open, his power was complete. So when he rode past Mara's place one afternoon and saw gray smoke drifting steadily from a shed that should have been falling down, he did what men like him always do when someone threatens a quiet monopoly. He smiled as if he were amused. Then he came to take a closer look. She was hanging the first strips when he arrived. Elk meat, rich and dark, cut long and even, salt already rubbed deep into the grain. The pieces dangled from iron hooks inside the dim little shed, catching the light when the door swung open. Vane stood in the doorway with his gloves tucked into his belt, looking past her at the meat. "Quite an operation," he said. Mara did not stop working. "Just a shed," she answered. He stepped in, wrinkling his nose slightly at the sharp, clean smell of green wood smoke and fresh-cut meat. "Most folks bring their game to town," he said. "Let the company barns handle the curing. Easier that way." "For them," Mara said. He let that pass. "I hear you've been buying carcasses from Ezra Pike," Vane went on. "Old man's getting too stiff to haul all that weight himself. Could have brought them to me. I pay fair." "You pay what people with no choice will accept," Mara said. She spoke it calmly, almost mildly, but the words landed between them with the weight of something that did not plan to move. Vane's smile thinned. "You know what happens when people play a trade," he said. "Meat spoils. Families get sick. Word reaches the company. Whole camps shut down. Seems a lot of risk for one woman with a homemade shed." Mara finished hanging the strip in her hand and finally turned to face him. "Then you have nothing to worry about," she said. "If I ruin this meat, everyone will come crawling back to your barn by January." He studied her a moment. Young, but not girl young. Hands scarred from knife work. Eyes that had seen men bleed out on snow and knew what real risk looked like. "If you're so sure your meat won't spoil," he asked, "why not sell me that rig and take work in town? I'll give you a decent price for the iron and the stone. Better than watching it all rot." Mara looked past him through the doorway, out at the valley, the trees, the thin roofs of minor cabins, the single-track west where the supply wagons came late as often as they came early. "My father didn't build this so one man could decide who eats," she said. "He built it so people wouldn't starve if the mountains decided to close." She met Vane's eyes again. "I'm not selling you that." For a heartbeat, the shed was very quiet. Then Vane gave a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Have it your way," he said. "When the elk goes sour and the smoke turns rancid, you'll wish you'd taken the coin." He stepped back into the daylight, pulled on his gloves, and turned his horse toward town. "Folks already have a name for places like this," he called over his shoulder. "Ash sheds, graveyards for good meat." Mara listened to the hoofbeats fade. She shut the door, checked the small fire in the pit, adjusted the vent so the smoke rolled thick and low around the hanging strips, then stood a moment in the dim warmth, breathing the sting of it into her lungs. Maybe they were right. Maybe the winter would be mild. Maybe the wagons would never miss a run. Maybe all this work would look foolish by spring. But every instinct in her bones, every lesson her father had hammered into her hands, whispered something else. Do the work while you still can. Because when the cold truly comes, you do not get another chance. By the end of that week, the rafters in Marabelle's smoke shed were dark with meat. The fire burned steady, and Red Timber Pass went on with its days as if nothing in the valley had changed at all. By the end of September, Red Timber Pass had stopped pretending summer might come back. Frost stayed on the grass until mid-morning. Elk coming down off the high ridges carried coats too thick for anyone to call this a mild year. Most people saw the color in the aspens and thought only of how pretty it looked. Marabelle saw how fast the leaves were falling. She tightened the rope on the next quarter of elk, dragged it to the block behind her cabin, and set the knife where her father had taught her years before. Cut long with the grain. Trim away the fat that would sour. Keep what could dry and smoke clean. By noon, strips of dark meat hung in neat rows from the iron hooks inside the rebuilt shed. By evening, they had taken on the first sheen of salt and smoke. The fire in the stone pit burned low and steady, sending a gray, sweet line of smoke through the vent into the cold air. No roaring flames, no drama. Just slow work against a season coming on fast. The more she hung, the more the town talked. Women at the pump stared at the thin plume rising day after day behind her cabin. "Too much for a woman alone," one said. "That's butcher's work." Men outside the saloon leaned on the rail, watching the smoke.
Belle's fixing to fumigate the whole valley, a miner joked. When that meat turns, we'll smell it clear up the pass. Someone laughed and said it didn't matter, by Christmas they'd be calling that shed the biggest buzzard feeder in Montana. The first nickname slipped out on a cold bright morning. Smoke widows at it again, a man muttered, nodding toward the steady line above her roof. It stuck. Mara heard it carry on the air. She wiped her hands on her apron and went back to the knife. Names wouldn't keep anyone standing in February. Ezra Pike came the day the wind sharpened enough to sting the eyes. He was leading a packhorse that looked half buried under elk. Age had bowed his back but not his stubbornness. Instead of turning toward the company barn, he swung through Mara's gate and stopped beside the block. "Stores that way," she said, nodding at town. Ezra snorted. "Stores had enough off me," he answered. "Your father kept meat hanging in that shed when other men's barrels were empty. Figure I'd rather see this go where somebody remembers how to make it last." He glanced at the open door. Inside, rows of strips already darkened the rafters. Smoke curled around them in soft, slow folds. "He made me taste my first strip in there," Ezra said. "Best thing I ate that winter. Burned my tongue and I still smiled." Mara felt something tight in her chest ease, just a little. "Help me with this, then," she said. They worked until the light thinned, cut, salt, hang, 2 sets of hands moving in a rhythm older than either of them. When the last piece was up, the shed felt different, less like a gamble, more like a promise. Ezra leaned in the doorway, watching the smoke drift. "Folks say you're gonna rot the whole pass," he said.
Mara nudged a coal back into place. "Folks say a lot of things when they don't want to hear the wind," she replied. He chuckled. "Well, I hear it. And if Vane's got a quarrel with where my elk ends up, he knows where to find me." Silas Vane came the very next morning. Frost rimmed the weeds along the path. His coat was buttoned high, gloves neat, boots clean in a way that said he'd stepped down from a porch, not off a ridge. He reined in at the gate and watched Mara splitting kindling. "You've been busy," he said. "Winter's coming," she answered. "It doesn't care if I'm tired." He walked toward the shed, hands clasped behind his back like a man inspecting a building he already owned. The closer he came, the stronger the smell of smoke and curing meat became. "How much have you got in there?" he asked. "Enough," she said. "Enough for what?" "For it to matter when the trail closes." He smiled without warmth. "I keep this camp fed," he said. "The company trusts me to know how much will last. They don't want some widow experimenting in a backyard. You start undercutting my prices, you put everyone at risk when your meat turns." "If it turns," Mara said quietly, "you'll have your customers back by January. You'll raise your prices, and they'll pay." He watched her, waiting. "If it doesn't turn," she went on, "and I sell it into your barn now, they'll still pay your prices. Only this time they'll starve on meat I handled and never saw." The smoke drifted between them. "My father didn't build this, so one man could own the valley's hunger," she said. "I'm not selling it into that." For a heartbeat, something like irritation flickered across Vane's face. Then he laughed once. "When men start falling sick from your cleverness, remember I tried to spare you that," he said. He turned back to his horse. By the time he reached town, the story had already begun to twist. At the pump, women heard that Mara had refused help from the only man who knew how to keep meat safe. Outside the saloon, someone raised a tin cup and said, "To the smoke widow and her rotting shed," and the laughter rolled out into the cold. Behind her cabin, Mara checked the hooks as the light went. The meat felt firm under her fingers. The salt had done its work. The smoke wrapped everything in a steady, sharp curtain. She listened to the distant voices. They sounded small against the timbered slopes and the long, low sigh of wind coming down from the high country. She banked the fire, closing the little pit until only a dull red glow remained, and pulled the shed door shut. The latch dropped with a solid, final sound. Out in town, men were still laughing at the woman filling a crooked shed with meat they thought would never last. Up in the hills, the first real winter clouds were piling over the ridge. Between those two truths, the old smoke shed kept breathing quietly, stacking days in the rafters while the valley chose not to notice. Winter did not arrive at Red Timber Pass with one grand storm. It came in small betrayals. A dusting of snow that did not melt from the shadowed side of the cabins. A night when the pump handle froze solid and men had to breathe on it before they could draw water. A morning when the creek's edges turned to dull white glass and stayed that way all day. By November the trail west had begun to lie. Some days it looked passable. Other days it disappeared under a skin of blown snow that turned wagon ruts into guesswork. Down in town, people trusted the calendar more than the clouds. The big freight's due in a week. Someone would say at the company store. Flour, beans, pork. No sense fretting. Marabelle watched the sky instead. Clouds moved differently now. Heavy and low, dragged across the ridges like someone pulling a blanket over a sleeping giant. The elk had vanished into timber pockets, not lazily, but with the quick, worried movement of animals that remembered something men had forgotten. She spent those days almost entirely between cabin and shed. The racks inside were near to full. Elk, deer, a little beef from a rancher down valley whose steers had done worse on the summer grass than he liked. Strips hung so thick now that she had to shoulder her way through them, hands skimming the meat, checking for soft spots, for any hint of sour. She found none. The fire, banked just right, kept breathing along the stone floor. Smoke coiled up and around the hanging rows, clinging to their surfaces, turning raw flesh into something that could wait as long as the mountains demanded. The gossip, like the weather, changed tone. Early on, people had laughed. As the air sharpened, the jokes grew quieter. Some men who had mocked her loudest in September started knocking on her door at dusk, their hats in their hands. "Just a strip or two," one said. "For my missus. She worries." Mara weighed out small bundles without comment, taking payment in things winter respected: candles, dry kindling, an extra wool blanket. Not always enough for the meat she gave, but enough to tell that these were not gifts. Work for work. Preparation for preparation. Word reached Silas Vane. He responded the way men with too much pride and not enough margin always did when they felt a grip slipping. He talked louder. At the store counter, he warned wives in worried tones that home-smoked meat often carried sickness. Outside the saloon, he stood under the lantern and spoke of sanitary practices and proper brining, phrases borrowed from company papers, not mountain winters. "If she gets it wrong," he said one night, loud enough for the whole porch to hear, "you'll see it in your children first." Bellies turned, fevers, men too weak to swing a pick. All because somebody thought they knew better than people trained to keep a camp fed. Nobody mentioned that Silas Vane had never spent a night tending a fire in a smoke shed. He didn't need to. He had a barn, a ledger, and a contract. People were used to believing men who owned buildings. Then the first real snow came. It fell out of a sky the color of hammered lead and did not stop for 2 days. The road vanished under it. Wagons due from the railhead never appeared. When the storm finally broke, a few riders tried to follow the trail and turned back before noon, faces cut raw, horses lathered and shaking. "Drifts up to a man's chest in the notch," one said. "Freight'll be delayed, that's all. They'll come through when the pass calms." The camp wanted to believe him. Belief was easier than hunger. So they stretched their fresh meat a little thinner at first. Less on each plate, more bone in the pot. Mara listened to the talk when she went into town for salt and lamp oil. "How long's your shed supposed to last?" A woman at the pump asked her, not unkindly. "As long as it has to," Mara replied. "That's not an answer. It's the only one winter gives," she said. December came in hard. The temperature fell and did not climb back. One older miner collapsed in the street from a chill that would have been nothing in October. 2 children in a side cabin developed a cough that never fully went away. Their mother came at dusk one night, asking if there was any meat she could put in their broth. "Silas won't give me more unless I pay double," she said, eyes rimmed red with cold and something else. "He says the wagons are late and he can't empty his barrels." Mara wrapped a small bundle from one of the older rows and pressed it into the woman's hands. "Boil it slow," she said. "Make them drink as much of the broth as they can." "How much do I owe you?" "Bring a handful of dry wood when you have it," Mara answered. "And tell the boys to keep their feet off bare boards at night." The woman nodded, clutching the parcel like something fragile. By mid-month, everyone knew the same 3 things. The freight had not come. The mining company was worried but far away. Silas Vane's barn did not look as full as it once had. The man himself grew sharper at the edges. He snapped at clerks. He shorted scales. He warned more loudly about experiments behind cabins that would doom them all. Once, passing Mara on the street, he stopped and looked directly at her. "If the company asks me why rations are thin," he said, voice calm but tight, "I'll tell them where half the valley's meat went this autumn." "You mean the half that's still hanging in my shed," she said. "The half not under contract," he replied. He walked on before she could answer. The second storm came just after Christmas, not as deep as the first, but colder. Snow squealed under boots. Frost crawled 5 inches down cabin windows. The breath in the air at morning looked solid enough to touch. After that, people stopped talking about when the wagons arrived. They started saying, "if," in low, careful voices. Till evening, when the sky was clear enough to hurt, and the stars looked close and pitiless, Ezra Pike came up Mara's path with his hat in his hands and his shoulders dusted white. "Went by Vane's this afternoon," he said. "Barn's got more echo than meat." Mara said nothing. She didn't need to. Ezra's eyes softened. "They'll be coming up here more now," he went on. "Not just for a strip or 2, for winter." Mara looked toward the shed. Smoke drifted slow from the vent, steady as breathing. Inside, the racks were still heavy. Not endless. Heavy. "Then we'll make it stretch," she said. "How?" Ezra asked. "Same way you walk a bad trail," she replied. "Short steps. Watch every foothold. Don't waste what you can't get back." The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Mara opened the shed door and stepped inside with a candle. The meat hung in close dark rows, the air thick with salt and clean smoke. She ran her palm along the nearest strip, feeling the give in it. There was less weight than there had been in October. Enough still, if they were careful. She listened to the faint crackle of the fire in the pit, and the even hush of wind moving past the boards outside. The town below was finally beginning to sound the way the mountains had been sounding for months. Worried. The winter had tightened its grip on Red Timber Pass. The margin for pride and rumors was almost gone. Soon, it would be down to meat, wood, and the stubbornness of those who had prepared. And there, at least, Mara Bell did not feel poor. The storm that finally broke Red Timber Pass came without warning. No thunder, no lightning, just a hard night wind that woke people from shallow sleep. And by morning, there was no town left to see, only white. Snow didn't fall, it attacked. It drove sideways into every gap, piled waist-deep against doors, erased the road and the fences and the tracks in a single, grinding blur. Men who tried to walk to the company store turned back after 20 yards, faces cut raw,
their own footprints already gone. Somewhere beyond the notch, the freight that was only delayed lay frozen in place. Inside the pass, the cold started counting what was left. At the store, Silas Vane stood in a room that finally matched his words. Empty. The last barrel had already scraped bottom, a few strings of jerky hung on the far hook, more bone than meat. When desperate men came in with their hats in their hands, he could only put smaller pieces on the scale and talk faster. "The wagons will move when the wind drops," he said. "You know how this goes." But nobody really believed the old rhythm anymore. Not with the windows frosting from the inside. Not with the floorboards creaking under fewer and fewer boots. By the third day of white, people stopped going to his door. They went to hers. Behind her cabin, Mara Bell woke before light and opened the smoke shed into a world that had shrunk to the size of the doorway. Snow had piled almost to the lintel, but the little overhang her father had insisted on years ago kept the entrance clear enough to move. She shoveled a narrow throat back to the yard, then ducked inside to check the only numbers that mattered. Hooks. Rows. Weight. There was less than there had been, but the racks were still heavy with darkened strips. Enough, if nobody pretended it was plenty. She coaxed the coals in the stone pit back to life, watched smoke rise and turn slow around the meat, then stepped out into the wind again. The first knock came before she reached the cabin. A woman stood there with snow caked in the hem of her skirt and frost in her lashes. "My boys can't keep food down," she said. "They've had nothing but thin flour and water 3 days. Silas says he's out." Mara didn't ask for details. She opened the shed, took down a strip from the oldest row, cut it into 2 narrower pieces, and wrapped them in cloth. "Boil this slow," she said, "make them drink the broth even if they can't chew." "How much?" "Bring dry wood when you can stand in it," Mara said. "That's all." By noon, there was a line. Men, women, a few older children, all hunched against the storm, moving forward a little at a time as she worked. Breath smoked in front of their faces, then streaked away in the wind. No one wasted energy on talk. From the ridge, the line looked like a dark stitch sewn into a sheet of white, tying the cabins to that one small, breathing shed. Silas Vane watched it from his own window.
Around him was more echo than goods now. Shelves held only dust, and a few cracked tins nobody had wanted even in good times. The ledger on the counter had gone quiet. He saw the gray column of smoke lifting from behind Mara's place, steady as a heartbeat. He saw the way people leaned into the storm in that direction, not toward his barn. For a long moment he stood there, hands on the windowsill, jaw tight. Then he put on his coat. The wind hit him like a shove as soon as he stepped outside. Snow took his feet out from under him once, twice, before he got as far as the bell yard. By the time he reached the back, his breath burned, and ice had formed in the corners of his beard. The line didn't move for him. He took his place in it with everyone else. When he finally reached the shed door, Mara looked up from the scales she kept in her head, not in her hand. "Mr. Vane," she said. He had to raise his voice a little over the wind. "I've got clerks at the store," he said. "A boy who works the scales. They trusted me when I said the freight would come. I was wrong." He didn't dress it prettier than that. Pride had less weight than hunger now. Mara studied him for a heartbeat. The shed warm at her back, the storm clawing at him from behind. Months ago, he had offered to buy the hooks and the stone and the racks, and put his name on all of it. Now he was here with empty hands. She reached for the meat, took down 2 strips, and cut them smaller before wrapping them. "This much will keep you and yours on your feet 3 days, she said. "If you treat it like a feast, it'll be gone by morning." He swallowed. "How do you want it paid?" he asked. "In spring," she said. "When the thaw comes, you'll bring boards and men and fix every leak in this roof. Free, same way everyone else is paid. For the part of winter they survived under it." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once and took the bundle. What little warmth there was inside the shed washed over his face as he turned away. It smelled like everything he had not believed in until it was too late. Salt, smoke, work done before anyone thanked you. The storm held the pass for another week. In that time, Mara's world shrank to counts and coals. Morning, check for damp, trim away the smallest pieces for broth. Slide the outer rows inward as hooks emptied. Day, open the door just enough to pass out what she'd measured the night before. Never more, never less. Night, sit by the pit, sleeves rolled, eyes half closed, feeling the fire's breath against her palms, and the building shift around her in the wind. Once, a heavy gust drove snow back through the vent and smothered the coals. Smoke rolled low and sour. Breaths turned into coughs. For a sick second, she thought the whole winter might be about to fail in one bad draft. She dropped to her knees, scraped aside ash with bare fingers until she found a coal still faintly alive, cupped it in both hands, and fed it slivers of dry wood until the glow came back. Slow, stubborn, just like the work. By the time the wind finally eased and the world outside the shed's doorway returned to something like shapes instead of a single howling blur, the racks inside were thinner. But not bare. Enough. Red Timber Pass had gone through its worst week on meat cut and salted and smoked by a woman everyone had mocked in September. When Mara stepped out into the sudden stillness and saw the valley again, the cabins half buried, the road just a suggestion under the drifts, the thin smoke from other chimneys, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Winter had shown everyone whose work had been talk, and whose had been fire, hooks, and quiet, steady preparation. Block 5 begins after the storm loosens and the first wagons finally appear on the horizon. The storm left the pass, the way a big animal leaves a room. Not all at once, just a slow, reluctant loosening. The wind dropped from a roar to a restless mutter. Snow stopped knifing sideways and began to fall in softer, separate flakes. Shapes emerged where there had only been white. The suggestion of a fence, the angle of a roof, the black line of the road, half buried under drifts. No one in Red Timber Pass called it over. They just called it bearable. On the first clear morning, men stepped out of cabins and shaded their eyes against a sky that looked too blue to trust. Children were sent to stamp paths between door and woodpile. Women opened shutters that had been frozen shut so long they groaned. Before anyone checked the store, before anyone went to see what was left in Silas Vane's barn, they checked the smoke shed. The line that had once reached into the storm was shorter now, but it was there. Faces gaunt, shoulders tired, but standing. Mara counted them the way she counted hooks. One, then another, then another. Inside, the racks were thin. 2 rows left, enough to carry them into whatever came next if they didn't forget what winter had just tried to teach. She weighed strips with her hands and her eyes, and the sound a piece made when she bent it. She gave more to families that had been hit harder. She gave less when she could see a man had already begun to grow back a little color. Nobody argued. They were too busy staying alive. A week later, someone on the ridge shouted from the notch. Wagons. Real ones this time. Not rumors, not hope. Dark shapes on the far side of the pass, moving slow but moving. Their canvas tops hunched under the weight of the snow still clinging to them. The shout rolled down the valley like a second thaw. Men whooped. Children ran. Even the old stood a little straighter. The freighters came in with their teams blowing hard and their faces pinched from the cold. They spoke of drifts that had nearly swallowed axles and a wagon lost to ice farther east. They spoke of other camps that hadn't had a Marabelle and a full shed. No one in Red Timber Pass needed the comparison spelled out. They had been hungry. They had not been starving. In the days that followed, the company men did what company men always did after a disaster narrowly avoided. They took notes. They asked questions. They called a meeting. Not inside the church, too small. Not in the store, too empty of respect. Instead,
They chose the flat patch of ground between Mara's cabin and the smoke shed, because everyone already knew that was the place where things had actually been decided. People gathered in coats and mismatched scarves, boots sinking into the thawing crust. The superintendent read from a paper with stiff fingers about supply chain disruptions and local mitigation strategies. What he meant was simpler. They would not leave the valley's winter to a single barn in distant freight again. They offered Mara a contract
Silas Vane had, with fancy ink and one name on top. This one mentioned shared responsibility. It asked her to keep doing what she had already done. Fill the shed before the snow, keep a ledger in weight instead of coin, and be ready when the pass closed. She listened with her arms folded, smoke from the shed drifting lazy between her and the men with papers. When they were done talking, she said one thing. If I do this, I do it the same way as this winter. No man goes hungry because he can't match another man's purse. If you want pretty records and neat numbers more than you want people standing upright in March, find another smokehouse. The superintendent blinked, then gave a slow nod. Standing upright in March will do, he said. The crowd let out a breath no one had realized they were holding. Reverend Cole stepped forward after the company men. He was not holding any paper. His voice carried anyway. In the autumn, from that pulpit up there, I hinted that a woman cutting meat in her yard was stepping outside the life laid out for her, he said. I worried more about appearances than about mouths. He looked around at the faces, then back toward the shed. I was wrong, he said simply. Work that feeds the hungry is never out of place, whether it happens under a steeple or under a smoky roof. If you must choose who to trust next winter, trust the hands that kept meat on hooks when the rest of us were making excuses. He tipped his hat to Mara, not low, not theatrical, just enough to make clear who had carried what. Then he stepped back into the crowd like any other man. Silas Vane was there, standing near the edge of the gathering with snow still clinging to the seams of his boots. He looked smaller than he once had. Not because he had shrunk, but because the town had finally gained something solid to measure him against. He did not speak. There was nothing he could say that would sound like anything but a late confession. Now and then his eyes slid to the shed, the same building he had once tried to buy for scrap, the same hooks he had called a graveyard for good meat. He watched people bring small offerings without being asked. Extra logs, sacks of salt, a new iron pan someone had traded for at the wagons. The pass was voting with its hands. Mara caught his gaze once. She did not hold it long. She had other work. Spring did not arrive on schedule just because the wagons had. It crept in. Snow sank. Ice rotted from the edges of the creek. Mud replaced drifts in the track to town. One bright day, Ezra Pike stood beside Mara as she lifted the last 2 strips from the hooks. That's it, he said. That's enough, she corrected. Because the measure of the winter was not how much meat remained. It was how many people did. She handed him one of the strips. For you, she said. He turned it in his fingers. Feels like a whole season, he said.
It is. They shared it in silence, leaning against the sun-warmed wall of the shed while the valley leaked meltwater and a raven circled lazily over the ridge. When the thaw set in for real, Silas Vane arrived with 3 men, a wagon of boards, and a coil of new shingles. He did not come to bargain, he came to work. They tore off the old roof, strengthened the beams, sealed every crack that had let in wet the last 2 years. When it was done, he stood in the yard with sawdust on his coat and looked at what he had helped keep standing. Roof won't leak now, he said. It won't get the chance, Mara replied. I'll have it smoking before the next frost. He gave a brief, worn smile. Reckon that's true. No forgiveness was spoken, none was required. The winter had already judged everyone's choices. Years later, people who had never known the bad storm would ask old-timers why the little shed behind the Bell place was the first thing they inspected every autumn. They'd get the same answer in different words. Because there was a year when the freight didn't come. Because there was a week when the wind tried to scrape us off these mountains. Because a woman everybody called a fool turned out to be the only one who treated hunger like something you could see coming. Mothers pointed toward the shed when telling their children why you put food by even in good months. Fathers told their sons that not every important building had a sign on the front, some just had smoke you could count on when the sky went wrong. And whenever someone in town started laying in supplies, too early for anyone else's taste, stacking wood higher than they needed, curing more meat than looked reasonable, sealing cracks in doors before the first frost, nobody laughed. They remembered how expensive that laughter had almost been. On certain cold evenings, even long after the pass had regular freight and better barns, Mara would open the smoke shed door and step inside for a moment. The smell wrapped around her the way it always had. Salt. Wood. Memory. She'd run her fingers along the hooks, check the draw of the smoke, listen to the soft tick of the fire settling. Outside, weather would do what weather always did, kind some years, cruel others. Inside, there would be rows of dark, quiet insurance against whatever the mountains decided to send. That was the lesson Red Timber Pass kept after the worst winter it had ever seen. You can't argue with storms. You can only listen early, work while others talk, and make sure that somewhere in the valley, a small, stubborn shed is already filling up long before anyone believes it needs to.